Sarah Martinez had always been different from other girls in her small Texas town. While her classmates spent weekends at the mall or painting their nails, she was out in the desert with her grandfather, learning to read wind patterns and calculate bullet trajectories. Her grandfather, a former Marine sniper, had noticed something special in Sarah when she was just 8 years old. She had an uncanny ability to predict where moving targets would be, not where they were. By the time Sarah turned 18, she could hit a soda can at 800 yards with her grandfather's old hunting rifle. But in the eyes of most people in town, she was just another pretty girl who happened to enjoy shooting as a hobby. They saw her long blonde hair and delicate features and assumed she was playing dress-up when she carried a rifle. Even her own parents thought it was just a phase that would pass once she found a boyfriend. When Sarah announced she was enlisting in the Army, the reactions were mixed. Her mother cried, worried about her daughter's safety. Her father shook his head, convinced she would wash out of basic training within weeks. The local boys she had grown up with laughed behind her back, making jokes about how she would probably use her rifle as a makeup mirror. Basic training proved them all wrong. Sarah excelled in every aspect of military life, but it was on the shooting range where she truly shined. Her drill instructors were amazed at her natural ability, but even they underestimated what she was capable of. They saw her hit every target with precision, but they had no idea she was holding back, afraid of drawing too much attention to herself. After completing basic training with honors, Sarah was assigned to Fort Braxton, a sprawling military installation in North Carolina. The base was home to some of the military's most elite units, including a special operations sniper school that trained the best marksmen from all branches of the armed forces. Sarah arrived at Fort Braxton as a newly minted private first class, assigned to a regular infantry unit. The male soldiers at Fort Braxton had heard rumors about the girl from Texas who could shoot, but when they saw Sarah step off the transport bus, their expectations plummeted. She stood 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed barely 120 pounds. Her uniform was perfectly pressed, her boots shined to mirror brightness, and she moved with a grace that seemed more suited to a dance floor than a battlefield. Sergeant Mike Rodriguez was the first to greet the new arrivals. He was a 20-year veteran with arms like tree trunks and a voice that could be heard across the entire base. When he called Sarah's name during roll call, he had to look around twice before spotting her near the back of the group. She stood at attention, her spine straight and her eyes focused straight ahead, but Rodriguez couldn't shake the feeling that she looked like she had wandered onto the base by mistake. The other soldiers in Sarah's unit were equally skeptical. There was Tommy Chen, a wiry kid from California who had joined the Army to prove himself after being picked on throughout high school. Marcus Washington was a former college football player from Alabama who could bench press twice his body weight. Jake Sullivan came from a long line of military men and had been preparing for Army life since childhood. These men had all struggled through basic training, earning every callus and scar along the way. When Sarah was introduced to her new squad, the atmosphere in the barracks became tense. The men didn't know how to act around her. Some tried to be protective, offering to carry her gear or help her with tasks they assumed would be too difficult. Others resented her presence, feeling that the Army was becoming too soft by allowing women in combat roles. A few simply ignored her, hoping she would realize she didn't belong and transfer to a different unit. The first few weeks at Fort Braxton were challenging for Sarah. She was assigned to the same duties as the men, but she constantly felt their eyes on her, waiting for her to fail. During morning runs, she kept pace with the group despite her shorter legs. During equipment maintenance, she learned to field strip and reassemble weapons faster than most of her squad mates. But it was the comments and whispers that wore on her the most. "I bet she's never even fired a shot in anger," Marcus would mutter to his friends. "She probably thinks this is some kind of summer camp," Jake would add with a smirk. Tommy, trying to be kind, would often say things like, "Don't worry, Sarah. If things get tough, we'll take care of you." The breaking point came during the unit's first trip to the firing range since Sarah's arrival. The entire company was participating in quarterly marksmanship training, and the atmosphere was competitive. Soldiers bragged about their previous scores and made bets about who would shoot the highest marks. When Sarah picked up her assigned M4 rifle and began adjusting the sights, several men gathered around to watch. "Careful with that, sweetheart," called out Corporal Davis, a thick-necked man from Montana. "Those rifles have quite a kick." Sarah said nothing, but her jaw tightened slightly. She had been dealing with condescending comments for weeks, and her patience was wearing thin. She took her position on the firing line and waited for the command to begin shooting. The targets were standard military silhouettes, placed at distances ranging from 100 to 300 meters. For most soldiers, hitting the center mass at 300 meters was considered excellent marksmanship. Sarah glanced downrange and felt a familiar calm settle over her. These distances were nothing compared to what she had been practicing with her grandfather since childhood. When the command to fire was given, Sarah squeezed off her first round. The bullet struck the 300-meter target dead center. She fired again and again, each shot finding its mark with mechanical precision. Around her, other soldiers were struggling to hit their targets consistently, but Sarah's shots formed a tight cluster that could have been covered with a quarter. Sergeant Rodriguez watched through binoculars, shaking his head in disbelief. He had seen thousands of soldiers qualify on this range, but nothing like what Sarah was doing. She wasn't just hitting the targets. She was placing each shot exactly where she intended, with the casual confidence of someone plinking cans in their backyard. When the firing exercise ended, the range went quiet. Sarah's target was retrieved and passed around among the other soldiers. Every shot had hit within the innermost ring, creating a pattern so tight it looked like the work of a machine rather than a human being. The men who had been making jokes about her shooting ability suddenly found themselves at a loss for words. But instead of earning respect, Sarah's performance had the opposite effect. Some of the men became resentful, convinced that she had somehow gotten lucky or that the targets had been placed closer than regulation distance. Others became more protective, assuming she must have had special training that gave her an unfair advantage. A few simply refused to believe what they had seen. "Beginner's luck," Marcus announced loudly as the company walked back to the barracks. "Let's see her do that when bullets are flying back at her." "Maybe they gave her special ammunition," suggested Jake. "I heard sometimes they do that for the cameras when politicians visit." Even Sergeant Rodriguez seemed unsure about what he had witnessed. He pulled Sarah aside after the range session and asked her about her background. When she mentioned her grandfather's training, he nodded and made a note in her file, but she could tell he was still puzzled by her performance. The real test came 2 weeks later, when the base hosted its monthly long-distance shooting competition. This event was taken seriously by everyone on Fort Braxton, from the newest privates to the base commander himself. The competition featured targets at distances up to 1,000 meters, and it typically drew participants from the sniper school and other elite units. Sarah heard about the competition through base announcements, but she had no intention of participating. She was still trying to fit in with her unit and didn't want to draw more attention to herself. However, fate intervened when Corporal Davis approached her in the mess hall with a challenge that would change everything. "I hear you think you can shoot, Martinez," Davis said, loud enough for half the mess hall to hear. "How about you put your money where your mouth is and enter the competition this weekend?" Sarah looked around and realized that most of the soldiers in her vicinity had stopped eating and were listening to the conversation. She could see the doubt in their eyes, mixed with a kind of cruel anticipation. They wanted to see her fail publicly, to prove that her performance on the qualification range had been a fluke. "I don't think that's necessary," Sarah replied quietly, hoping to defuse the situation. "Come on, Martinez," Davis pressed. "You embarrassed half the company on the qual range. Don't you want to show everyone what you can really do?" The challenge hung in the air like smoke. Sarah realized that backing down would only reinforce the perception that she was weak or afraid. But accepting the challenge meant potentially exposing abilities she had kept hidden her entire military career. She thought about her grandfather's words. Sometimes you have to let people underestimate you, but sometimes you have to show them who you really are. Fine, Sarah said, standing up from her table. I'll enter the competition. The mess hall erupted in whispers and excited chatter. Word spread quickly throughout the base that the new girl from Texas was going to compete against some of the military's best marksmen. Most people saw it as entertainment, expecting Sarah to be eliminated in the early rounds. They had no idea they were about to witness something that would become legend at Fort Braxton for decades to come. The morning of the long-distance shooting competition dawned crisp and clear, with virtually no wind to speak of. Sarah arrived at the range early, carrying her grandfather's old rifle case alongside her military-issued equipment. She had received special permission to use her personal weapon, a custom-built rifle that had been in her family for 3 generations. The competition range was unlike anything most soldiers had ever seen. Targets were positioned at distances ranging from 600 meters out to the maximum range of 100 to 200 meters. The furthest targets were barely visible as tiny specks on the horizon, requiring powerful scopes and perfect atmospheric conditions to hit consistently. Professional spotters with high-powered telescopes were stationed at various points to help competitors track their shots. As Sarah set up her equipment, she became aware of the crowd gathering behind the firing line. Word about the competition had spread throughout Fort Braxton, and soldiers from various units had come to watch. Many were there specifically to see the girl from Texas, who thought she could compete with the base's elite marksmen. The other competitors were an intimidating group. Staff Sergeant Williams had won the competition 3 years running and held several base records. Master Sergeant Johnson was an instructor at the sniper school with over 15 years of experience. Captain Torres had represented the military in international shooting competitions. These men had dedicated their entire careers to perfecting their marksmanship skills. When Sarah approached the registration table, the range officer did a double-take. He had expected all the competitors to be grizzled veterans covered in tattoos and scars. Sarah, with her neat ponytail and standard-issue uniform, looked like she had wandered into the wrong event. "You sure you're in the right place, soldier?" the officer asked, checking his roster twice. "Private First Class Martinez reporting for the long-distance competition." "Sir," Sarah replied formally. Behind her, she could hear snickers from some of the spectators. Someone made a comment about how she would probably need help lifting her rifle. Another voice suggested they should move the targets closer so she wouldn't embarrass herself too badly. The competition format was straightforward but challenging. Each shooter would engage targets at increasing distances, starting at 600 meters and working up to 200 meters. Points were awarded based on accuracy, with bonus points for hitting the center ring. Shooters were eliminated if they missed more than 2 shots at any distance. Sarah drew the number 7 position, meaning she would shoot in the middle of the group. As the first few competitors took their turns, she studied their techniques and observed how the minimal breeze was affecting bullet trajectories. Each shooter was allowed 3 shots per target, and most were struggling to maintain accuracy as the distances increased. When Sarah's turn came, she moved to the firing line with quiet confidence. She set up her rifle with practiced efficiency, adjusting her scope and checking her equipment one final time. The first target was at 600 meters, a distance she had been shooting regularly since she was 12 years old. Sarah settled into her shooting position and controlled her breathing. The range fell silent as spectators waited to see how the newcomer would perform. Through her scope, the target looked almost close enough to touch. She squeezed the trigger gently, and her first shot struck the center ring perfectly. A murmur ran through the crowd. Sarah's second shot hit within an inch of the first, and her third shot completed a triangular pattern that could have been covered with a silver dollar. The range officer announced her score, and several spectators applauded politely. "Not bad for a warm-up," commented Staff Sergeant Williams, who was shooting in the position next to Sarah. "Let's see how you do when things get serious." The 800-meter target presented a greater challenge. At this distance, even small environmental factors could throw shots off target. Sarah took more time with her setup, making minute adjustments to her scope and studying the mirage patterns that indicated wind direction. When she fired, her first shot hit slightly left of center. Sarah made a small correction and fired again. This shot was perfect. Her third shot matched the second, creating a two-shot group that impressed even the experienced competitors. She was tied for the lead heading into the 1,000-meter stage. The 1,000-meter target was where most competitors began to struggle seriously. At this distance, the target appeared as a tiny dot, even through high-powered scopes. Environmental factors became critical, and the slightest mistake in calculation could result in a complete miss. Several competitors had already been eliminated, unable to keep their shots on the target consistently. Sarah approached this stage differently than the others. She spent several minutes studying the range through her scope, watching for subtle signs of wind patterns and atmospheric disturbances. She noticed that most shooters were aiming slightly too high, not accounting for the way heat from the ground was affecting bullet trajectories. Her first shot at 1,000 meters hit the outer ring, earning her points but not the maximum score. Sarah frowned slightly and made a small adjustment. Her second shot moved closer to the center, and her third shot hit the bullseye perfectly. The crowd began to take notice that this young woman was not just lucky, but genuinely skilled. By the time the competition reached 200 meters, only 5 shooters remained. Sarah was among them, along with Staff Sergeant Williams, Master Sergeant Johnson, and 2 other veteran marksmen. The atmosphere had grown tense as spectators realized they might be witnessing an upset. At 200 meters, the target was almost invisible to the naked eye. Shooting at this distance required not just skill but also an understanding of advanced ballistics and environmental factors that most soldiers never learned. Sarah had never attempted a shot quite this long, but her grandfather had taught her the principles that would guide her calculations. Staff Sergeant Williams shot first, managing to hit the target with 2 of his 3 shots. Master Sergeant Johnson followed with similar results. The other competitors struggled, with one being eliminated for missing the target completely. When Sarah's turn came, the range had grown completely quiet. Even the wind seemed to have stopped blowing. She could feel hundreds of eyes watching her as she set up for what would either validate her abilities or expose her as an imposter. Sarah spent nearly 10 minutes preparing for her shots. She studied wind flags, observed mirage patterns, and made calculations that took into account factors most shooters never considered. The range officer grew impatient and reminded her that she had a time limit, but Sarah continued her methodical preparation. Her first shot at 200 meters sailed wide, missing the target entirely. A collective sigh went up from the crowd, and Sarah heard someone say, "There it is. She finally found her limit." But Sarah wasn't discouraged. She had learned valuable information from that first shot about how conditions were affecting her bullets at extreme range. She made significant adjustments to her scope and changed her aiming point completely. Her second shot hit the target's outer ring, earning her points and keeping her in the competition. The crowd stirred with renewed interest. Sarah's third shot moved closer to center, and suddenly she was back in contention for the overall win. The competition came down to a sudden death shoot-off between Sarah and Staff Sergeant Williams. They would each take 1 shot at a special target placed at 1,000 meters. Whoever came closest to the center would win the entire competition. Williams shot first, placing his bullet just outside the center ring in what was considered an excellent shot under pressure. The crowd applauded, and Williams smiled confidently as he stepped back from the firing line. Sarah approached her final shot, knowing that she needed to hit the center ring to win. The pressure was immense, with hundreds of people watching and her entire reputation hanging on a single bullet. She thought about her grandfather and all the hours they had spent together in the Texas desert, preparing for a moment exactly like this one. As Sarah settled into her shooting position, something remarkable happened. The doubts and pressures that had been weighing on her suddenly fell away. She felt the same calm focus that had carried her through countless practice sessions. The rifle felt like an extension of her body, and the target seemed to call to her through the scope. Sarah's final shot struck the exact center of the target with precision that silenced the entire range. The spotters confirmed that her bullet had hit dead center, while Williams's shot was measured at just over an inch away from the bullseye. Sarah had won the Fort Braxton long-distance shooting competition as a 19-year-old private with less than 6 months of military service. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some spectators cheered enthusiastically, genuinely impressed by Sarah's remarkable shooting. Others stood in stunned silence, unable to process what they had just witnessed. A few grumbled about beginner's luck or questioned whether the competition had been fair. Staff Sergeant Williams was gracious in defeat, shaking Sarah's hand and congratulating her on the victory. But she could see the questions in his eyes, the same questions that were being asked throughout the crowd. How had a rookie soldier with no formal sniper training outshot some of the military's most experienced marksmen? As Sarah collected her trophy and prize money, she overheard fragments of conversations around her. Some people were already spreading rumors about her background, suggesting she must have had professional training or special advantages. Others simply refused to believe what they had seen, insisting that something about the competition must have been rigged. The victory should have been a triumph, but Sarah felt strangely hollow as she walked back to her barracks that evening. Instead of gaining acceptance from her peers, she seemed to have created even more distance between herself and the other soldiers. They no longer treated her as just another recruit, but they didn't treat her as an equal either. That night, as Sarah cleaned her rifle and reflected on the day's events, she made a decision that would change the course of her military career. She was tired of hiding her abilities and tired of being underestimated. If people were going to treat her differently anyway, she might as well give them a good reason. The next morning brought news that would give Sarah the opportunity to prove herself in ways she had never imagined. A new training exercise was being announced, one that would test the skills of Fort Braxton's best soldiers in realistic combat conditions. Sarah decided she would volunteer for the most challenging role available, regardless of what anyone else thought about her qualifications. 3 weeks after her competition victory, Sarah found herself lying motionless in a concealed position on a rocky hillside, watching Fort Braxton's main compound through her rifle scope. The massive training exercise known as Desert Storm had been designed to test every aspect of modern military operations, from logistics to communications to combat effectiveness. The exercise scenario was complex. Sarah's unit was playing the role of insurgent forces, attempting to infiltrate and neutralize key targets on the base. The defending forces consisted of elite special operations teams who knew the terrain intimately and had every technological advantage. Most military experts expected the exercise to demonstrate the superiority of conventional forces over irregular tactics. Sarah had volunteered for the most dangerous assignment in the entire exercise. She would operate as a lone sniper, tasked with eliminating high-value targets from extreme range while avoiding detection by sophisticated counter-sniper teams. It was the kind of mission that typically required years of specialized training and experience. Her position was carefully chosen on a mountain ridge approximately 15 miles from the base's main command center. At this distance, most soldiers would need artillery support to engage targets effectively. But Sarah had studied the terrain for weeks, using topographical maps and satellite imagery to find the perfect vantage point. The command center was housed in a reinforced concrete building at the heart of Fort Braxton. During the exercise, it would be occupied by the opposing forces' leadership team, including several high-ranking officers who were participating as observers. Sarah's mission was to simulate eliminating the enemy commander with a single precision shot. What made the mission nearly impossible was not just the distance, but the security measures in place. The defending forces had deployed counter-sniper teams throughout the area, using thermal imaging and acoustic sensors to detect any threats. Multiple layers of security patrols were constantly sweeping the surrounding terrain. Sarah would have one opportunity to take her shot before every enemy unit on the base would converge on her position. As dawn broke over the North Carolina landscape, Sarah began her final preparations. She had been in position for over 6 hours, moving so slowly and carefully that she had covered less than 50 meters since darkness fell. Her ghillie suit, constructed from local vegetation and burlap, made her virtually invisible against the rocky terrain. Through her scope, Sarah could see activity beginning around the command center. Vehicles were arriving and personnel were moving in and out of the building. According to the exercise timeline, the enemy commander would appear on the building's observation deck at exactly 0800 hours for a briefing with his staff. Sarah checked her equipment one final time. Her grandfather's rifle had been modified with a high-powered scope and specialized ammunition designed for extreme long-range accuracy. She had calculated the ballistic data dozens of times, accounting for factors like air density, temperature, humidity, and the Coriolis effect caused by the Earth's rotation. At 15 miles, the bullet would take nearly 30 seconds to reach its target. During that time, any movement by the target would result in a miss. Sarah would need to predict not just where her target would be when she fired, but where he would be half a minute later. At 0755 hours, Sarah spotted movement on the command center's observation deck. Several figures in military uniforms had emerged from the building and were setting up what appeared to be a briefing area. Through her powerful scope, she could identify individual officers and track their movements. The exercise commander, a full colonel named Harrison, was easily recognizable by his distinctive bearing and the way other officers deferred to him. Harrison was a decorated veteran with combat experience in multiple theaters, and his presence added realism to the training scenario. Sarah watched as Colonel Harrison positioned himself behind a podium on the observation deck. Other officers arranged themselves in a semicircle around him, creating the perfect target scenario for a sniper. But the distance remained almost impossible to imagine. 15 miles was farther than most people could see clearly on a good day. At exactly 0800 hours, Colonel Harrison began his briefing. Sarah could see his mouth moving, but obviously could not hear any words from her distant position. She estimated that the briefing would last approximately 15 minutes, giving her a window of opportunity to take her shot. Sarah settled into her final shooting position and began controlling her breathing. At this range, even her heartbeat could affect accuracy, so she timed her shot for the natural pause between breaths when her body was most stable. She made final adjustments to her scope, accounting for the slight breeze that had picked up as the sun rose higher. Through her scope, Colonel Harrison appeared as a tiny figure, barely larger than the crosshairs themselves. Sarah had to use her imagination more than her eyes to visualize the exact aiming point. She thought about all the practice sessions with her grandfather, all the calculations and preparations that had led to this moment. What happened next would become the subject of debate and investigation for years to come. According to multiple witnesses and electronic monitoring systems, Sarah fired a single shot at exactly 0812 hours. The bullet traveled through the morning air for 28 seconds before striking a target dummy that had been positioned to simulate Colonel Harrison's location. But the official records didn't tell the whole story. What really happened was far more remarkable and controversial than anyone initially realized. Sarah had indeed fired at the designated time. But her target was not the dummy everyone assumed she was aiming for. Through her scope, she had noticed something that the exercise controllers had missed. A small mechanical malfunction in one of the base's defensive systems had created a potential safety hazard that could have endangered the personnel on the observation deck. Instead of taking the expected shot at Colonel Harrison's position, Sarah had aimed at a small electronic device that was beginning to smoke ominously near the briefing area. Her bullet struck the device precisely, neutralizing the malfunction and preventing what could have been a serious accident. The impact of Sarah's bullet was detected immediately by the exercise monitoring systems, but the exact target took several minutes to determine. When investigators examined the observation deck, they found the destroyed electronic device and realized what Sarah had actually accomplished. From a distance of 15 miles using iron sights and manual calculations, Sarah had identified a potential safety hazard and eliminated it with surgical precision. The shot required not just incredible marksmanship skill, but also the judgment to abandon her assigned mission in favor of protecting human lives. The exercise was immediately suspended while officials investigated the incident. Sarah was escorted from her position by helicopter and brought before a panel of senior officers for debriefing. The questions came rapidly. How had she detected the malfunction from such a distance? Why had she decided to deviate from her assigned mission? How was it even possible to hit such a small target at 15 miles? Sarah answered each question honestly and directly. She explained that her grandfather had taught her to always prioritize safety over mission objectives. She described the extensive calculations required for extreme-range shooting and demonstrated the mathematical formulas she had used. But she could see that many of the officers remained skeptical about her capabilities. The controversy deepened when ballistics experts examined the shot in detail. The bullet had traveled through multiple atmospheric layers, each with different wind patterns and air densities. Computer models suggested that the shot was theoretically possible, but practically impossible, requiring perfect conditions and flawless execution. Some officers suggested that Sarah must have had assistance from spotters or electronic guidance systems. Others proposed that the shot was simply an incredible coincidence, that she had missed her intended target and accidentally hit the malfunctioning device. A few even suggested that the entire incident had been staged for publicity purposes. But the evidence was overwhelming. Multiple independent witnesses had observed Sarah taking the shot from her confirmed position. High-speed cameras had recorded the bullet's trajectory, and ballistics analysis confirmed that it had come from her rifle. There was no question about what had happened, only about how it was possible. The investigation concluded that Private First Class Sarah Martinez had indeed made a successful precision shot at a distance of 15 miles, setting a new record for extreme-range marksmanship. The shot was officially verified and documented, though the full details were classified for security reasons. The aftermath of the incident transformed Sarah's military career. She was immediately recommended for advanced sniper training and offered positions with elite special operations units. Military researchers wanted to study her techniques and develop new training programs based on her methods. But for Sarah, the most important outcome was not the recognition or the career opportunities. It was the respect she finally earned from her fellow soldiers. The men who had once questioned her abilities now sought her advice and training. The same base that had initially treated her as an outsider now celebrated her as one of their own. Years later, Sarah would go on to serve with distinction in multiple combat deployments, saving countless lives through her exceptional marksmanship skills. She would train a new generation of snipers and develop techniques that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible in long-range shooting. But nothing would ever quite match the impact of that single shot on a clear morning at Fort Braxton. In 30 seconds, a bullet fired by a 19-year-old soldier had traveled 15 miles to prevent a potential tragedy and establish a record that would stand for decades. The lesson was not lost on the military leadership. Talent and ability could emerge from the most unexpected sources. and the greatest achievements often came from those who were initially underestimated. Sarah Martinez had proven that true marksmanship was about more than just hitting targets. It was about making the impossible shot when lives depended on it. The base never forgot the day when everyone assumed she was just striking a pose, only to watch her 15-mile shot silence every doubt and criticism that had ever been raised about her abilities. Sarah had found her place in the military not through politics or connections, but through the pure demonstration of skill that no one could question or deny.